missed the introduction, but we're going to start with the first talking points from Sir Lawrence, if you may. And then, do you need the?
No.
Oh, that's great.
I'm just going to talk.
And then we'll just follow this. And after they speak, we will open to questions. I'm sure we'll have a long Q&A period.
Thanks very much. It's very timely, if I may say so, discussion to have. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the impact of mobilization on Russian society and the politics. I will concentrate on the military effects, and in doing so, to give a sort of structure to how we should try and understand this terrible war. It's important to note how the war began. Why? The first question is why mobilization didn't take place from the start. Ukraine mobilized at the start, Russia didn't. The reason is clear: this was a special military operation, was not expected to take that long, was thought to be quite straightforward. The key units involved were quite elite units in the first instance, and the aim was to topple the Zelensky regime, as it is described, or the Nazi regime, as Mr. Medvedev called it again today, and in some way, I don't think it's been fully worked through, subjugate Ukrainian society. As we know, this didn't work. The next stage, a month later, was to refocus the campaign on the Donbass. That also struggled, and the main consequence of the period, particularly, I would say that the period from April to late June, was Russia making some advances. There were some big battles of the Mariupol, Donetsk, and so on, but at enormous cost. Cost to the Ukrainians, cost to the Russians. And you're starting to see the consequences of all the effort that's been put in from late February in terms of shortages of manpower. And it's worth noting the Russian armed forces never had enough infantry, partly because of doctrine, because of the way that the groups were organized. But this got worse over this period. Morale was low, there were shortages, plus, of course, they were going through their kit, going through their ammunition, and a crisis of sorts was developing. I think at the time, and this is when you heard most about the war being stalemated and the need for negotiations to bring it to a conclusion because neither side could win quickly. The key thing that was happening was that, and this is obviously a bit glib, but as Russia was turning more and more into a 20th century army, having to use equipment that was being brought out of storage and was quite old, going back to veterans of earlier wars, Ukraine was slowly becoming a 21st century army as it was gaining equipment and material, some of the best from the United States and its allies. And during July, we started to see the effects of that, particularly with HIMARS, and a very different strategy being adopted by the Ukrainians to the Russians, whereas the Russians had a rather traditional artillery barrage and softening up defences until they could resist no more. The Ukrainians were using their armed forces, which were more precise, with greater precision, going for ammunition dumps, command posts, and logistics in general, and gradually, slowly undermining the capabilities of Russian forces at the front. They announced in August the Kherson offensive, which made progress, but pretty slow progress. And again, this encouraged the view that this was an attritional, long-term war. And then all of a sudden it broke, first in Kharkiv, and then more recently in Kherson as well. And Russian forces found themselves pushed back in some disarray, in some cases less so in Kherson, and it's annoyingly, embarrassingly for Putin, just as he was announcing all of this was Russian territory, he managed to lose Russian territory in a quite dramatic fashion, and it was embarrassing. And I don't think one can underplay, given this is a personalist dictatorship, the impact of these the setbacks on the regime itself. But I'll leave others to talk more about that. What I think then happens is a couple of things. Is first, even before this, when Putin met up with Xi and Modi, the American, the Shanghai Cooperation Forum, he realized that his support perhaps wasn't as effusive as he might have hoped. Clearly, Modi and Xi made clear their misgivings about where things were going. Then came the Ukrainian offensives. And I think this is the context where I think, as has been the case with Putin's decision making, rather than take big decisions quite early on, so in a sense to get the maximum advantage from them, he prevaricates, he puts them off, they're delayed. So that mobilization, which people were expecting on the 9th of May, the victory parade, didn't happen then either. He kept on putting it off, possibly because he knew what effects this might have on the Russian population. Equally, although annexation had been talked about, again, from quite early on, this also was put off. But now I think the moment of sort of double or quits came, and he doubled down. So that's the background to mobilization. But leaving it this late seems to me to have limited whatever impact it might have been able to make. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the others. What I'd say, so let me just make a few points about why I don't think mobilization can make a great military effect. First, there are some of the mobilized troops, especially those who've been recently conscripted, who will sort of know what they're supposed to be doing. You can't dismiss hundreds of thousands as all being military inept, but a large number of them are. They've had no experience, or their experience is very dated. Secondly, there's nobody around to train them properly. And you may not have to go to Western lengths of months of training before you dare send somebody out into the field, but a week or two is not normally considered enough, or days in some cases already. So you're not generating new combat power, because this isn't at the moment in a fit state to make a difference on the battlefield. What you're doing is sending more mouths that have to be fed at the front line at a time when logistics are already strained, and people who don't know what they're doing, and who, as far as one can tell, if they're not killed early on, will surrender at the first opportunity. Again, I'm overstating it, but this is the sort of risks that are now being faced. How could it work? Jack Watling at RUSI provided, I think, the best account of how it could work. Essentially, that they set up new defensive lines as quickly as possible, and intend to keep them through the winter, while a good chunk of the new draftees are knocked into shape so that they can form offensive battalions at in the spring, when it would be suitable for having another go at Ukrainian positions. The problem, I think, that has been faced with that is, first, surviving the winter is not going to be an easy thing. What you're starting to see is a question of who's going to get the winter kit first. There are a lot of promises being made to the Ukrainians of first-class winter kit. Finns came in with some the other day. It's not clear where the Russian winter kit is going to come from, and if it doesn't get to them, that is really quite an issue. You may have already, you've got to be careful with all these social media posts. You've probably already seen some of the new draftees being dumped, actually not even in Ukraine, but with sleeping bags, no tents, and the weather already getting rather cold. This more strategic point is that Putin has not been very good at being ready to concede territory, at least once he decided that the focus was on the Donbass. So you've actually had a tension, which I think explains a lot of what's going on at the moment, between Putin's determination not to give an inch, not to give up on any of the major cities that they've been trying to get, and in a military sense that actually, if you want to set up new defensive lines, you need to evacuate, you need to move to better positions that aren't so where your forces aren't going to be stretched so thin, where you've got more natural barriers to help you. And then again, this may have been left too late. And actually wary about predicting this war. It's had many twists and turns. But there's clearly a crisis brewing over Kherson, the forces of Kherson, who are trapped in and around the city. And again, the Ukrainians have used their means to knock out the obvious means to retreat. So I think that the war is finally poised. The structure of the war favours Ukraine at the moment, quite substantially. Obviously, things have happened today which are awful, but don't change that. The structure of the war still favours Ukraine. What the Russians have done today, they can't do every day. If you want to talk about tactical nukes, we can, but tactical nukes really don't fix any of the political and military problems that Putin faces. Meanwhile, this is where I'm going to stop and hand over, you've created a crisis internally because of the effect of mobilization on Russian society. But that's
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to, actually I was going to refer to Jack Watling, so thank you. Well, Jack was getting quite a few mentions today, but yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications for the ongoing war, but I'll also talk a bit as well about some of the impact on the political system to the extent that we can tell what's going on. As always, that's the caveat. So I think one thing that has been a constant throughout, since the beginning of this war really has been, that the idea that Russia is fighting the West via the war with Ukraine, if you like. And Putin justified the mobilization on the basis that Russia is fighting what it calls the entire Western military machine. So this is the kind of partly the justification for this mobilization. So the more weapons and so on that Ukraine receives from the West, the more imperative it is for Russia to mobilize in order to counter that. And actually, an interesting point that Jack Watling made was that for the West, there's a risk that given Russia's military position on the ground, i.e. its apparent weakness vis-a-vis or strategic disadvantage vis-a-vis Ukraine, that mobilization is met with complacency. So I hope that that won't be the case. And we've already heard about Germany. In fact, I think it's a few days ago that Germany sending air missile defense systems to Ukraine. But I think there's going to, although Ukraine does have the strategic advantage, I think Ukraine has been very clear about calling for, more assistance and specifically, air defense systems. I think, again, as Jack Watling pointed out, and Laurie just referred to, it is going to be very difficult, even with this mobilization, for Russia to actually build any force that could really overwhelm the Ukrainian army. So it's more about stabilizing those Russian losses and trying to, if you like, eke out or protract the conflict, going beyond maybe 2023. And crucially, obviously, it's also then testing Western resolve to continue to send weaponry and to continue to send financial aid. So that's, I think, one of the key things to bear in mind. So coming to Russian to Russian mobilization, I think again it seems very late in the day, and the very critical Russian losses that we saw early on in the war, I think, are going to be very hard to replace with this mobilization. And clearly, it's a mobilization that's being, to the extent that we can tell, resisted, certainly in some areas of Russia, like Dagestan, for example. We saw these videos of, people of these big protests outside the kind of recruiting stations and so on. Obviously, it's difficult to generalize, but I think it'll be interesting to see, maybe Gulnaz or others can speak to that point, because I think we really need to keep an eye on those regions like Burya, Dagestan and so on, these quite poor regions, which are providing the cannon fodder. It's not a foregone conclusion, of course, that, they're all going to somehow rise up against the centre, but, a kind of groundswell of dissatisfaction that carries on for some time, once it's perceived that they are the cannon fodder, could well lead to continuing unrest. Coming back again to this point about the West, today, even when Russia is bombarding Kiev, Russia says essentially that the West has really forced Russia. It had no choice, if you like, to storm major cities. And this has been the narrative the whole time. And as we know, Russia has been using cruise missiles to carry out these strikes. And these are, by their nature, precision missiles. So I think it has been pointed out that therefore they know very well actually what they're targeting. These are not mistakes when they hit a children's playground, for example, or a university. And of course, in Syria, they mainly fought there with long-range precision strikes. And Russia has been very focused on developing those weapons, I think, especially since Georgia 2008, where very clear that Russia, was lacking, if you like, in that area. Just coming back to the point about, if there is any resistance, if you like, to this mobilization. I mean, there clearly are pockets of resistance. There was a Levada survey that showed that while in May, 73% of Russians thought that the war was going fairly well, whatever that means, by September, only 53% of Russians still thought the war was going well. Another area, region where there have been quite a lot of problems with mobilizing and calling up troops has been North Ossetia as well. And I think the North Caucasus in general is an area to keep an eye on. An interesting point, I think, as well, is if we're talking about the need to maybe step up production of armaments and so on, is that there's quite a serious lack of manpower in the Russian defense industry. And apparently the Russian parliament is actually meeting to discuss these supply issues on the 17th of October. So I think that's also something else to bear in mind. It doesn't necessarily have an infinite supply of armaments. And even if, they try to sort of put things onto a wartime footing in terms of production, this lack of manpower is going to be very difficult for them to overcome. I think something that's been doing the rounds, if you like, on Twitter, but not only on Twitter, of course, is this idea that, the kind of pro-war party, if you like, in Russia, the kind of more extreme nationalist groups are really criticizing Putin, have been really suggesting you must retaliate for the Kerch Bridge, for example, otherwise you're going to look weak. Incidentally, people are also suggesting that actually these strikes today are not necessarily retaliation for the bridge. They were actually already planned quite some days ago. But even so, clearly, in terms of the kind of domestic narrative, the retaliation, if you like, for the Kerch Bridge can really then look like a kind of counter-terrorism move, if you like. And obviously within Russia, the kind of memories of the apartment bombings and Beslan and various other sort of terrorist incidents mean that, this is sort of quite a useful way, perhaps, of presenting things. Previously, I think people have been pointing out any failures have been tended to be blamed on the Ministry of Defense rather than Putin. But there are, parts of this sort of pro-war nationalist grouping that now seem to be, if not becoming exactly anti-Putin, seem to be trying to shift a bit more blame onto Putin. And for example, you mentioned Putin's prevarication, suggesting that he is very indecisive, and actually why didn't he mobilize earlier on in the war, for example. But also, of course, there has been criticism of Shoigu, Gerasimov as well. And we now have the new chap in command, General Surovikin. So many people have, pointed out that he was at the helm in Syria, that he was one of the commanders in Syria, while his predecessor was as well. So, I think the sort of the cruelty tag, if you like, is not exclusive to him. So they're both quite well known for their brutality. But actually, Surovikin has already been in command of various operations in southern Ukraine. And as someone pointed out, he didn't exactly cover himself in glory there because he lost a lot of ground in Kherson. So, but it's still, we'll see what happens with him. But the point is that his appointment has been lauded and, praised by these sort of nationalists, these mill bloggers, if you like, on Telegram and so on. I think some people have also suggested that some of these nationalist groupings have been concerned that Putin is not really quite a committed enough nationalist, his commitment to this nationalist ideology seeming to waver. They've also pointed out that, Putin's red lines earlier on in the war, like NATO enlargement, delivery of strategic weapons systems and so on to Ukraine, haven't actually changed since earlier on in the war. And so there seems to be, if you like, I think Marlène Laruelle, said there seems to be some kind of confusion in a way now regarding the Kremlin's vision of the war, if you like, what actually is the vision, or is it just, pummeling Ukraine, until it can pummel no more. So it feels as if, one doesn't like to say this is a point because we don't really have that privilege yet of looking back in history. But I think that there certainly are signs of, disquiet, perhaps fracture within Russia. And of course, there is also the issue of the huge number of men leaving the country. I think a couple of 100,000 have gone to Kazakhstan. So actually, ironically, migration of Russians to Kazakhstan is becoming quite an issue for Kazakhstan. So I think that we are at a point where, what is the next step, if you like, for Putin? You just keep on and on escalating. So Lawrence said, you can't really keep up that level, if you like, of escalation every day. So, what is the kind of game plan, if you like? Somebody, Greg Yudin, I don't know if anybody follows him, but he's quite thoughtful of academic at a Russian university. He suggested that the radicals' concept of victory is just scare your opponent into submission, and also to celebrate the suffering of Ukrainians. Each new crime will be seen as insufficiently scary. So, I mean, this presupposes that we know that these nationalists somehow control the agenda. And I'm not sure that they necessarily do yet. But certainly it does seem as if maybe Putin is losing the initiative. And you could argue that every escalatory move is another admission of failure. Because also further escalatory attacks on Ukraine may well elicit the type of response from the West that hardliners see as validating their arguments. I'll stop there.
Thank you. The crisis is brewing was a brilliant phrase that captures first and second speaker's point. And how is this crisis working within Ukraine in terms of response of Ukrainian society? Let's Mark first, or you want first with Russia? Okay.
Maxim's gonna go.
All right. So Maxime will talk about Russian reactions and reactions to mobilization, and then we'll switch focus on Ukraine.
Yeah, things change so quickly. This panel was planned like a week and a half ago, and so much changed since this moment that it seems almost outdated now. But yeah, I want to talk a bit about two kind of aspects related to internal political situation. One is the war propaganda and effects of propaganda, and the other one is just Russians' attitudes toward mobilization. So I'm currently running two studies focusing on propaganda and attitudes, and we just saw very interesting changes in discourse and attempts to justify the invasion and the war. So what we found is that since the beginning of the invasion, the amount of war-related content on Russian television decreased 2 times, right? So between February and July, because people were just tired, right? So, and there's a lot of evidence corroborating this idea, surveys, audience measurement, people got tired of the news, TV channels were just losing audiences, people were tuning out. And the other interesting thing is that they mostly abandoned a set of narratives which used to justify the invasion in the beginning. So, for instance, when Putin announced the invasion, he mentioned denazification and demilitarization. So by spring, these narratives just disappeared from television because for the regime it became clear that do not resonate with the public, and people struggle to comprehend the meaning of the term. So what is denazification? We don't know. So they just disappeared. And there are clearly certain cracks in narratives. Some of them don't do work, so they try to adjust some of them. We observed cracks in narrative justifying the invasion. And very tellingly, in a new set of Kremlin's instructions for central media outlets and TV channels for covering partial mobilization, these terms were not mentioned either, right? So they just realized that they do not work, and they focused on those narratives which work, like NATO expansion and protection of Donbas people. So one, there are cracks in narratives. They are not that persuasive as they were in the beginning. And second, I'm also running projects sort of trying to understand Russia's attitude towards mobilization. We did not start this phase of research collecting, interviews asking about mobilization itself, but we previous phase also has some interesting findings. So we basically conducted interviews with people. So we have many interviews with regime supporters and people who support the war, but also those who oppose the war. But then there is a very interesting group in between. So these people who sort of trying to distance themselves from the war. And for them, it was possible to distance themselves from the war for many months before, but not now, because mobilization is something which intrudes into their private lives very violently. And it sort of forces a choice upon them, right? So you either side with the government or you side with the opposition. And I don't know, I can't predict how their sort of attitudes will evolve. Right now, I see that they're mostly dissatisfied, right? So, but maybe there'll be some changes. Maybe the government will proceed with mobilization in a different way and make them more happy and satisfied. But so far, it's a mostly negative reaction. Plus, we saw all these protests in Russian regions, which is quite a remarkable development, given the fact that political protests in Russia are usually confined to big cities and capitals. So it was something striking. I don't want to, make predictions about nationwide mobilization process, because for this you would need oppositional structures, which will completely destroy networks, and most importantly, the perception that there are some windows of opportunity. So there are, for instance, some groups within Elite who are not in agreement with Kremlin's policy, and they kind of show the signal, send the signal to the people. So I don't want to talk about this because it's very difficult to predict, but it definitely adds a certain degree of political instability and turbulence to the current situation. And the attack on Crimea Bridge and then today's acts of terrorism, right? They, I think, add even more turbulence to the system, because I think it's primarily for domestic consumption. Obviously, there were all these pro-war conservative bloggers who were asking for radicalization, and Putin basically demonstrated that he has options, right? So he can respond, he can do something after months of humiliation and defeats. And there is a caveat here, though. So they have been using this idea, the idea of attack on critical, quote unquote, critical infrastructure and decision-making centers. So this is basically the cliche which was used on Russian TV shows for quite a while. But they basically use this option to justify military defeat. So we are losing, and we are losing because we are humane. We do not strike critical infrastructure. We do not target civilians. And now they do. They use this option, which basically means that when they face more defeats, there are not that many excuses left to justify the invasion, because, okay, you are now targeting military civilian infrastructure, and there are not many successes. So I just want to repeat what my colleague said, that what happened today is not going to change the balance on the battlefield very much, or at least it seems so. And in this context, when situation evolves, they kind of don't have excuses and justifications for the invasions and failure anymore. So when they had this option before, they had sort of rhetorical structure, strategies to explain failures, but not anymore. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
The argument to raise voice, and I think with the growing absence of rhetorical strategies, what we might have to see is what's happening today. So next, Dr. Mark Aronson, please go yours.
So for a different flavor, I'm going to talk a bit about what's going on inside Ukraine. I think that in terms of Ukraine's response to Russia's mobilizing more forces, I don't think that that is triggered any type of unique or different response. Ukraine is trying to gain as much territory as possible, and trying to prepare for a counteroffensive that they expect from Russia to be coming in a few months' time. So the notion is to try and, here, I'll get to this in a second. And also, I think that the position of Ukraine and of Zelensky is almost the exact opposite, I think, of what Putin has in store. And that is that I don't think the Ukrainian people, as well as their president, are going to be satisfied until they have the return of all of their territory, including Crimea, that the borders are going to be reestablished based upon what they were in 1991, and that there'll be reparations paid for the lives lost and the damage done, and that there'll be war crimes tribunals, which may go up to the very top. But on the flip side, maybe I shouldn't say flip side, but there is a positive aspect of what is going on within Ukraine itself because of the war. And that is the people are with their state to a far greater amount than they've been in the last 30 years. So I undertook, I designed and commissioned a survey in August of this year across Ukraine, asking questions about people's attitudes towards the state, towards conscription, and so forth. And for these questions that you see before you, I asked them previously in November 2015. The first question is, do you support mobilization during war? Do you support the idea of mobilizing? And the previous version of the question was, do you support mobilization during the conflict in Donbass that was then a year old in 2015? And the number of people saying that they're supportive of it has skyrocketed from 36% to 80%. And that's just huge. And I will explain for a minute, all of these figures, after my 20 years of surveying Ukraine, I'm suddenly seeing big differences from what we've seen previously. Are you willing to serve in the army if you're subject to mobilization? 70% versus 25% a few years back. So even after war had been out, conflict had been sort of started in the Donbas region, the figure now of people willing to serve for their state has just skyrocketed since what's happened in February. Regardless of the war or the conflict, are you ready to comply with the law on conscription, even if you don't think the law on conscription is fair? And 72% said they're willing to obey such a law. Now, I've also been tracking another obligation of citizenship, besides, males of a certain age having to serve being a requirement of citizenship. Everyone's required more or less to pay their taxes. And I've been asking people in these countries, in Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, would they obey the tax laws, even if they disagree with them? And only if you look at the last figure from August of this year, the figure for 64% said they would agree. That is in line closer to Poland and above what it was for Russia. Ukraine, as you can see from the intervening years, from 2005, a year after the Orange Revolution, after the Euromaidan Revolution of 2014, after all these events, Ukrainians were not with their state and sort of just recognizing that they should pay taxes. And now they do. And this is creating a nation, if a nation was ever in question before. When it comes to trusting their state, 43% of Ukrainians now says the state fulfills their obligations and their duties to citizens. Still not a majority, but much higher. And I imagine that in many countries, not just Poland and Russia, in many countries, people don't feel as if their state is providing for them goods and services. But people with plurality believe that that's the case in Ukraine today. Do you think you can trust your state to do what is right? And here again, we have a majority, much higher than when it was like Poland and Russia during, peace times and so forth, or Ukraine during peace times. This is startling results for a country where people found every conceivable way to sort of maybe get away with things and not obey the state if they could not be punished for it. And then also, does the state relate to all citizens in an equal, fair manner? Again, we find that a larger amount of citizens said that the state does. Still, obviously not a majority, but higher than figures we've seen in, at least when I've surveyed the question elsewhere. Does the state protect you? This is huge. 81% of Ukrainians are saying in August that the state is protecting them. That's up from 23 to 28% in previous years. And it implies that citizens, obviously they know their livelihoods and their security is a threat, but they believe the state is with them and they want to be with the state as a result. Now, in terms of how Ukrainians are faring at this time, they're faring okay to poorly. It depends upon, obviously, the families. Family incomes, very few have said that it increased since the war started, or war sort of escalated in February. Most said there was no change or that there was a decrease in their family income. Ability to pay their taxes. Majority said that they're able to pay about the same. Others disagree. And ability to pay basic utilities. We're talking about heat, water, electricity, and so forth. 84% said that they can. And by the way, there are also programs that the state has launched out to try and help people at this time of war, and they're forgiving of arrears, so that that may add to the sense that the citizens have that the state is with them. I do think that sort of taking another step back to this situation, to this war, that Putin is being boxing himself perhaps into a corner. And there's very few things that I think he can do in light of what's going on. The talk about nuclear weapons, of course, is something that Putin has been raising to sort of create fear and so forth. There's a lot of discussion on how that practically would not make sense. If he was to use nuclear weapons, it would be tactically on the ground in Ukraine and militarily. Some people feel as if that's not going to actually achieve any objectives on the ground, or that's add things that much, would cause the ire of NATO countries to respond, as if they would somehow. Countries such as India, China, and elsewhere have already sort of given sort of some suggestions that they wouldn't be keen for that. But on the other hand, we just don't know. I don't think that, personally, I don't think Biden's comments that we're closer to 1962, yes, maybe by a few inches more than we were before this year, but at the same time, 1962 was a completely different scenario altogether. That was strategic intercontinental missiles and so forth. And we're just talking about whether nukes possibly may be used on the ground within a given territory. It doesn't sound like it would be practical for Putin to do so. We just don't know, obviously, with anybody sort of boxing themselves into a corner and not admitting either territory lost, including territory that has been taken from Putin since he's called for the annexation of these 4 provinces of Ukraine. And furthermore, I think the final point I guess I want to make is I don't think that Putin is the sole problem here. It is a Russia problem. It's a Russia problem that goes back to viewing national security interest to be about who controls the land between Berlin and Moscow. And that's always been sort of the main factor in Russian strategy, as far as I understand. Maybe the war studies folks could confirm or deny that. And so I think that the basic problem is it's not just Putin. There are others who think that Ukraine isn't a real country or shouldn't be a country. And the Russian people, until they're called upon to serve in the military through mobilization, aren't overwhelmingly going to the streets saying that they disagree with that.
Thank you. For one question. One question.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask it. Okay. You have for Sir Lawrence? Do you have? Okay. I have a question for Sir Lawrence, and this is from conversation. We see that the Russian government is overstretched in terms of both reproducing the military capacity at home because of they're using too much and they might not have the manpower, as Natasha mentioned, to reproduce the ammunition, the cruise missiles because of the technologies, etc. What is the extent of their potential reliance on purchases from Iran, from North Korea, from other countries of necessary for war equipment, armaments, ammunition that they can rely on and that they can, continue the military activity in the way that they have so far?
Well, they've got Iranian drones, which have proved quite effective. Truly, they have made a difference. I think the Ukrainians are starting to understand them better. They've captured some, they've taken them apart, they're using electronic warfare means against them, but they hurt and they cause problems. And the question is, why didn't the Russians have more? Because this is not exactly a novel feature of contemporary warfare. There were these talks about the North Koreans providing artillery shots. I haven't seen anything about it since that was mooted. Another question is, why not China? And here I think the most important American sanction is microchips, because they've got the proprietary rights to microchips. And the Chinese are not going to get in trouble on that. Taiwan provides an extraordinary number of the world's microchips, despite that. And so Russian defense industry has been crippled. Not just the manpower, it's a spare parts issue as well, which is why they're not producing new tanks, which is what one might have expected. There are other problems, of course, even if they do produce stuff, is getting it to the front, and their supply lines are getting more and more stretched and attenuated. So I think this is a basic part of their problem, that they can't produce. And going back to the Second World War, of course, as people tend to forget, Ukraine was also part of the Great Patriotic War. They can produce themselves out of trouble, and they have vast reserves of manpower which they use. They just don't have that, and that's why I think the long term it's not good. I mean, I think it's very difficult for them, and why, just to conclude, and I really do apologise. It's such an interesting conversation. I think that one of the big issues in all of this is the Russian military. This is going to take them years to reconstitute. Years. They've lost 6 years of defence production. They've lost an officer corps. They've lost elite regiments. They've lost their reputation. I would have thought at some point somebody at senior command is going to say, actually, if you want us to do all these other things an army is supposed to do, we can't carry on like this. I still think that's the major vulnerability that Putin has, despite the sort of hardline chaps. One of them, of course, the new one, took part in the 1961 coup, which is worth noting, and it's very 1991 coup, and it's close links with the hardline nationalists and with Wagner and so on. At some point, they're going to have to look at reality.
Thank you very much for joining us. Yes, and yes, I'll start with you, please.
First of all, thank you so much. It's so interesting and very timely. I'm here. I'm a new PhD student here. Originally, I'm from June. I think maybe most of them you can understand my feeling, what I felt when I say the war in Ukraine, because we experienced it. I have many questions, but I will try to ask just a final couple too. When this war started in Ukraine in February, I listened so many experts who suggested that Russia doesn't have enough resources to continue this war a long time. It could be finished in 2 weeks or 10 days time, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, most of them, their suggestion, we can see it's not the right, because it's more than 6 months, war is still continue, and we don't know how long it takes. My question is, if Ukraine will not allow to target Russia's main strategic, I'm not talking about civilians, main strategic objects, and will not allow Ukrainians to have that kind of weapons, how do you think this war will finish? Imagine World War II, yeah, when German attack to Poland, if the fighting point would be just Poland, how it could be finished, yeah?
Yes, thank you. Let's take a couple of more questions. So we got this question, right? That okay. Yes, please.
What do you think? The name June and Charlie used to be a law enforcement intelligence analyst. I've more recently been broadcasting on the border and did on live TV at the end of January when asked if there would be a war. I said 60-40 from north and south. I wasn't certain. That's what I gave reasons for that. My question, 2 quick questions. One is, what do you think is the minimum Russian geographic posture which would make a new offensive in the late spring or spring of next year feasible? Basically against Kiev, or if he still holds something at Kherson, in other words, west of the river. And second quick question, how much more pressure or encouragement or dialogue with the Russian diaspora in the West can be used to make it clear that there is no intention of destroying Russia. We're just trying to help Ukraine, and we do not murder inconvenient journalists.
Thank you. And one more question, and then we'll go to the panel. Yes.
So it came out today that Putin, just from the new general, is known for particular levels of brutality. He executed a group of freedom officer protesters. And my question is, to what extent do you think more extreme voices in Putin's circle are going to influence him to go further? For example, maybe using nukes, for example, maybe full mobilization or anything more extreme than what he's currently done.
Thank you. All right. Natasha, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a strategic expert like Laurie, so I'm not sure about the geographic point. I mean, you know, Russia seems to be very important. Was very important to Russia to hold on to Kherson, for example. I mean, I think it's going to be difficult for Russia without Crimea. You know, if it loses Crimea, symbolically, the whole thing goes up, really, because, you know, this is where it all started and this is where it took the Russian population on side, if you like, in terms of Russia rising from its knees and so on. So I certainly think that symbolically that would be very difficult for Russia if it were to lose Crimea. But also, obviously, in terms of the logistics and so on, as we've seen with the bridge, you know, that's a very key part of the logistics and so on for this war. I mean, obviously, you know, the eastern part of Ukraine as well is key in terms of, you know, the whole rhetoric of sort of, you know, saving the Russian speakers, if you like. Although I think we've seen that clearly, you know, people realise that, you know, that's not really, you know, that they're really losing, they've lost a huge amount of support in those territories, you know, whereas you could have said that there was some kind of Russian, I don't know what you want to call it, soft power there, you know, a few years ago. I think that's really eroded now. But just briefly, I mean, I'm not going to answer all of the questions, but your point, I mean, I think I said in the talk, you know, that Ukraine needs air defense systems, clearly. Otherwise, if it depends, you know, it's how will Russia proceed? I mean, as Laurie said, it can't carry out attacks and strikes like it did today, every single day, and it doesn't have an infinite number of cruise missiles. So then we'd have to see where would it get, you know, will Iran, for example, continue to supply Russia with drones? Is the Iran regime itself going to implode soon? Who knows? China isn't going to be forthcoming with any of that. So, you know, we'll have to see whether the Russian defense industry can continue supplying its needs, and seems to be a question mark over that. But certainly, apart from the German promise to supply some defense systems, so it's going to have to be a lot more than that for Ukraine, certainly the longer term.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of touched a bit on your question about Surovikin, I think, earlier, but I'll let others come in.
Yeah, the one about the mobilization, sort of Russian diasporas in other countries, right? Second one. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question because there are actually protests of Russian diasporas across the world. I think there are about 120 anti-war initiatives, and there were more than 300 protest actions in the past couple of months. But that's not enough, right? So we don't see large crowds of people protesting, and we can't really attribute it to the fact that they are embedding propaganda, things like that. So
They have families in Russia.
yeah, they have families in Russia, and yeah, I don't know how to make them mobilize really and protest. It feels like the problem in Russia is that many people are just, you know, repressed, right? So here the problem is that there is no object of protest. So how do you in Russia, you can protest against the government, but here you can't protest against British government, right? So there's no clear object except for Russian embassy. And in front of Russian embassy, there are protests every second weekend here in London and in many other cities. So Russian diasporas are limited in how they constrain policies with their government, so they can help Ukrainians. That's what they do a lot, like donations, helping people to leave Russia, those Ukrainians who were deported and stuck in Russia. But
if I may add to your first, or maybe it's a second question about, where there is some space for action or for clear messaging. So I would actually more point to your point about how the Western governments can come up with the clear message. And this is something that quite recently Daniel Drasner wrote. You can check, we had quite a nice, why are we talking about nukes? How should the West respond? The West should come out and say very clearly that we're not trying to fragment Russia. We want to stop war, we're helping Ukraine. The goal is not to fragment, not to do away with Russia, because that's the Russian Kremlin propaganda, and that's the words they play with. So the clearer and the louder that message comes out from the West, arguably, that's one way to counter the informational or the rhetorical strategies of the Kremlin. And there is that point. It was made quite recently by Dan Drezner. And I think there is something to say about that. Of course, there is also debate going on, should Russia exist at all, etc. It's always imperial, nuclear, etc. But these conversations, of course, increase the insecurity and suicidal trends among the Russian elites. So I think there is a very important point there. Mark, would you like to?
Sure. I last got word of the news, I think this morning, about what had happened in Ukraine, and I'm sure the events went on from there afterwards. But from what I gathered by the last point I listened to the news, was that about 80 some odd missile attacks had been made on Ukraine, and about half of them were shot down. And I was really impressed the fact that Ukraine does have the air defense systems that it does. I'm not saying it's what's desired. Of course, they need more.
Yeah.
But I just thought that was kind of impressive to be able to get down basically one out of every two. Basically, with respect to Russian military approaches and their ability to sort of prolong the war, I mean, we have a country of 140 odd million people versus a country of 40 million people. And Russia's sort of approach to, as I understand, the military is always to employ quantity when they lack quality. So if they don't have the highest, most teched up military, they'll have a lot more bodies to send into the mess and be able to keep sending in the battlefield. So I don't know how long that will last, but obviously that is part of the sort of game plan of probably any Russian strategist, that they can outnumber even if they're not out-equipped.
Yeah, I mean, assuming those troops don't desert because of, the poor conditions in which they're fighting, what have you.
And I mean, I imagine the mobilization is causing other problems for our society. I mean, if you're in university, you get a deferral from serving in the army. Well, how much does a deferral now cost? I mean, and how much does being able to have a place in university for a given year cost? And, who's going to have access to those positions and how they're allocated? It's obviously sort of providing another opportunity for more corruption and disintegration of the regimes.
And that's interesting because also if we come back to the point about the large number of people who have left Russia, mainly going to Kazakhstan, but also Georgia, it's the better off people who can do that, so you'll kind of be left with the much poorer, poorer regions.
Yeah. Let me add something with regard to your first question about how the unprecedented sanctions that were raised against Russia created an expectation that things will collapse pretty quickly, and yet Russian economy did hold up and is still holding up, and the degradation and the stagnation and the worsening of the economic condition is happening as we speak and is being felt more and more in various sectors, also inflation and production numbers, you know, the employment issues, they are being felt right now, but it did take some time and it still will, probably the situation will be worsening still. But it's interesting to think why we have inflated expectations with regards to how sanctions will work. The Russian government was preparing, you know, its various parts of the economy for something like that. It was not, I mean, from what we know, from around January of 2022, Prime Minister Elvira Nabiullina, ministers of economy, they were given tasks to have some sort of stress tests and to work on scenarios of what would happen if the war or military invasion of such a degree was not planned. But the conversations about increased stress, increased sanctions, various types of sanctions were held. And so they were somehow slowly preparing the economy, but also we should give credit to the funds that were accumulated from before. We should give credit to extremely high energy prices that were holding up Russian budgets, sort of on the spending spree, etc. And despite all these props, the economy is not going in the good direction for Russia, and that's pretty clear. And the worry and anxiety, including for the economic conditions, are growing. So it's not an implosion, but sanctions and implosion, usually the more moderate thinkers about the role of sanctions do not expect an immediate implosion. It was just the extraordinary amount of them that created such, I think, expectations. Okay, let's open for more questions.
Can I comment on this?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just, my personal sort of impression, I think it's a good question about how this war is challenging our predictions all the time. So I can list at least 3 moments when I, for instance, did not believe that war would happen, because, and most of my colleagues focus on comparative politics and domestic politics. They did not, because they focus on costs and benefits and internal politics. And from this point of view, they're completely meaningless, right? So the war is just madness. And yet it happened. Then many people believed that Ukraine would fail in a couple of weeks because they had weak military. It did not happen. And then many people believed that sanctions would ruin Putin's economy, and it did not happen. But with mobilization, for instance, I think we are sort of learning from our mistakes, and predictions become more careful. With mobilization, many people predicted that it would happen. And I would say that the majority of, I mean, we did not, there were some discussions about it in May, but I think at a certain point for most people, it became clear that it's a real opportunity that should happen at a certain point. So I think when you face all your biases, you can start learning stuff. Too late, right? Too late, but
it's interesting what you say about, you know, that people thought the Ukrainian military was weak, because that's obviously exactly how Putin was thinking, because he never paid any attention. He and his circle never paid any attention to what was happening in Ukraine, to the fact that actually they had been bolstering the military. They'd been doing that for quite a few years, but they didn't have any interest in what was actually going on inside Ukraine, you know.
And that's a part of the problem. There's a lack of attention to what was happening in Ukraine in the past, like 8 years, right? So it's been long-term process.
Yeah.
Right. But personalist dictatorship and sifting of information is a thing in personalist dictatorship. We have more questions there, please. Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm Mary Dejevsky, I'm a journalist. I've got a question for Mark Barronson. You gave both persuasive figures about how the war has been sort of a catalyst for the nation building that was already in progress. And you gave a figure of more than 80% for people who believe in the government's capacity to protect them. Do you get any sense of how fragile those figures might be, and how quickly they might turn if, for instance, you have more use of air power, as we saw from Russia today, with deaths of civilians in cities, and maybe the government isn't able to population?
It's a great question. This is argument for why, you know, surveys should continue. maybe I'll get more money to continue doing that. But yeah, I mean, one of the beauty of asking the same questions over and over again is you hope one day there'll actually be a different answer. And, I've gotten that with August, but whether that is going to sustain itself or not depends upon a whole lot of factors. Depends on what Russia's doing, the way the war is going on, and whether or not they believe in their leadership and their state. And so far, I mean, I think the Ukrainians are behind their leader and their state. And were that to change, I mean, were we to see sort of the scandals that are popping up in elections in the Western world with figures running for office these days, then maybe, but I think people feel as if the state is doing what it can. I would say personally, watching all of the news coverage, I've been impressed. I mean, there is a state in Ukraine that comes in after there's an attack or damage. You see emergency personnel, you see administrative local government support that come in, and they're doing something with whatever tragedy that has happened. And for whatever thoughts one might have that the Ukrainian state doesn't do much, it is doing, more than perhaps some would expect in those times. And then they're relatively soon, it seems, at least from this perspective, being in my couch in my end is not the same thing as being there right now.
Just a personal anecdote briefly before I go, which is that I messaged a friend of mine who lives in, a Ukrainian friend in Kiev, on Facebook today to say, how are you, with everything that's happening? And he said, don't worry, it'll be sorted out. Zaluzhny will sort us out, and we'll be okay because we're used to it.
The same.
It's-
I had the same response. I
Yeah.
think Ukrainians are more ready to fight than I sometimes have this feeling than government. And many my friends in Ukraine mentioned that
Yeah,
if Zelensky don't go this way, what he's
Yeah,
doing, we will move them.
yeah,
And it's a reason I think that survey what shows
yeah,
because of feeling people don't want to go back to Russia's dictatorship and control because we experienced so long time.
Yeah, okay, so Natasha, thank you very much. Questions?
I feel as if this is the reverse of the Tonight Show. Yes.
All right, please, let's start there and we'll take a couple. Yes.
Hi, George Gooden, Department of Studies. I have a question about the timeline. I strongly believe that the war was premeditated and scheduled at least a year in advance, perhaps more. Hence my question, do you believe that the date was chosen by the Russian leadership in advance? And secondly, if so, what is the self-imposed deadline they're working with? When is the war going to end in their thinking?
Thank you. Right there, please.
Yeah, I'm Tom. I do CSD at War Studies. But my question is, it's not directly on Russia exactly, but it's more about the things said today about Russia's agreements with Belarus today, and whether one, you think that's significant because it all seems a little bit vague at the moment, and secondly, if Belarus were to get militarily involved in any way, would it have any material impact?
Did you get that? I missed the first part of the, did you get it? Yes.
You're talking, what happened today regarding
With
Belarus?
Belarus and Russia, there were some sort of agreements made about the Union state military infrastructure being.
They agreed to form a.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't quite clear what they meant by that, and whether it was kind of a pre-indication of Belarus becoming involved or not. And if that were the case, would it make any difference?
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Ahmed, I'm the general public. My question is, this decision of so many contractors in the Russian military not to leave the country after 6 months, especially come September, forced Vladimir Putin, the defense ministry, to initiate this mobilization, because a lot of soldiers were on like 6 month rotating contracts, they just leave after the 6 months, and a lot of them decided to go particularly, and it's forced its hand, it's caused the personnel issues in the Russian military in the front.
Thank you. One more, yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, there have been reports of, I've had 700,000 people fleeing Russia to escape mobilization. The other side of that is that they are being allowed to leave. To what extent do you think that it's a deliberate policy to act as a sort of pressure release valve to sort of in that classic sort of exit voice scenario? And secondly, the other side of that is that you know, the EU and others in the West, there's a big debate about whether tourist visas should be allowed. How does that play into it? And I guess the third point, if you'll indulge me, is to what extent does this potentially provide problems for countries like Georgia, where tensions in Tbilisi, for example, have already been sort of reasonably well documented?
Thank you. Okay, let's try to answer. First, on the date of war, and anyone wants to jump in?
I have no idea. I mean, I have absolutely no idea. And quite frankly, I don't, from the questions I am concerned about, I don't think it matters at this point. I mean, yes, most likely there are a lot of scenarios that Putin had in mind, even before Crimea was taken. Whether they looked at an astrology calendar and said today's the day, or whether, you know, they sort of did a cost benefit analysis of how many Ukrainian troops are actually standing on the border of these provinces. I don't know. I don't think it matters at this point. What is going to drive this war on is how far Putin will continue to escalate this. I don't think that the ultimate problem with the war, in a sense, is Ukraine does not want to give up any territory that it believes is theirs, especially, and the country's motivated like it's never been motivated before to fight for it. On the other side, Putin feels it probably has to show that he's got something at the end of it. Moreover, if he doesn't get what he wants, and it's not completely clear we know exactly what he wants, but if he doesn't get what he wants, who's to say that a year or two or three, he or some other person of his comrades are going to say, we need to refight this war, just like they started the war in February. They started up in February after many people thought everything was resolved from 2014. So where the end of this is unknown, but it has to be reading somebody's mind who's very difficult to obviously read or get to.
So if I may try to answer that question, I also believe that the war was planned. We see it through various indicators. First, the bringing the troops to the borders a year before in April, and that tension was de-escalated after a meeting with Biden was agreed in summer. They met, and it's clear that when Biden came to power, the Kremlin wanted to push through specific guarantees of NATO non-enlargement or whatnot, sort of for Russian security interests, and so the they were not bluffing, so to say. But the first meeting on the top level allowed them to try to talk, but that meeting, I remember it very well. The conversation was about the red lines in terms of cyber attacks, and Biden drew very clear lines, and Putin met an mature adult, and he understood that there will not be any caving in from the West. And then around November, December, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued sort of very ultimatum-like demands that Lavrov submitted with the demands that were not met, and the way that these demands formally were articulated was very clear that they were not already at that point. They didn't believe that these demands will be met and that the war will be a result. It was like a little justification that, look, we wanted to talk, we brought these demands, but our demands were not met. There was no negotiation over these points that are important to us. Hence, we didn't have any other any other way to go. So just the ultimatum-like formality that was given as a way to negotiate suggested that they were planning for next action that needed to be justified with these documents. So, but in terms of course, I think, in wintertime, right, they were hoping for still frozen, so there are military tactical issues linked to the fact that for Russians to fight in summer and in spring and fall is much harder than to fight in winter when the ground is frozen. And if you plan to overtake a country in a week, that's what you do. That's why they started. So I think absolutely there was planning there. Anyway, that's.
I just want to say that the principal question was when the war will end. I understand the futility of our wondering on when it was supposed to start, but I think we're all interested when it will end from humanitarian perspective of this. And I think that ending is implied in the beginning. There is some kind of frame that the military, well, they have to operate.
They wanted to end it in a week.
Right, but then you explained nicely that the war permutated into a completely different war than the Blitz they envisioned first. And that's the type of war I'm.
Maxim, you want to add
Yeah,
something?
just quick comments. Like just a moment, I remember from January and February. So one of the reasons why I personally didn't believe that there was no propaganda campaign whatsoever, right? That's why the invasion itself came as a shock for the public, because it just out of blue, out of sudden, we are starting the war with Ukraine. So I think it was planned, as you said, in advance, but very narrow group of people knew it, and it was not predetermined. So they were looking for windows of opportunity. So maybe the West will give us something, maybe they will back down. And when Putin sort of realized that it does not seem to be that there are no windows of opportunity, then he started. So it was prepared, but he was not probably sure he would start. And that's why there was no preparation, because I think he believed at a certain point that he would get something. And that's why maybe it's not war starting.
Yeah. And there were a few other questions. I'll respond to your question in terms of the exit option. I do believe that that is the case. There was some uncertainty with regards to whether the borders will be closed to anyone leaving Russia after mobilization was announced. There were conversations about the extent of limits, who can and who cannot live. I think there were some considerations that included, if you don't allow all male, what type of tensions and protests will it create for Russia? The government doesn't want protesters, and those who are leaving are mostly not the rural folks, but they are leaving who are able, capable, with money, a lot of them from big cities. And big city protest is a big threat to the system. So I think the analysts and the government people who talked about then, sort of allow for some people to leave as a ventilation effect, as an exit option to avoid potential voice option is the strategy that fits very well with reliance and over-reliance on both contractors and mobilization happening in the less diverse, poorer, economically more strenuous regions, places, territories in Russia. So I certainly saw that exit option as being a chosen strategy, but they had to deliberate because they do not want to lose all the male body from the society. And indeed, there are big debates with regards to the reception in Georgia and Kazakhstan and other countries in the those that allowed the Russians without visas to enter. In Kazakhstan, they have to decide, how much Russians they can absorb, I see different stances on it. I see clips that show, young Russian men questioned, who's this Donbass? Who's this Crimea? And if they don't say, well, it's Ukraine's, if they start sort of talking and wiggling, and this is given as, these are imperial Russians, why are you letting them in, etc.
We have the same situation in Georgia. Georgians are very afraid because quiet modes. Russians moved since February, and there started problems like when, for example, restaurants had a sign like Slava Ukraine and something like that. They are Russians are protesting why you are doing this sign, and there are quite tense situation.
Yes.
Quite.
So absolutely. So it does create problems and issues and debates in these societies where Russians are fleeing to. The question on contractors and the end of the contractors time. I think with the mobilization, the contractors that are in the war, they cannot really quit. There were new rules taken that they cannot quit. So it's not with regards to contractors, but really the losses and reaction to humiliation and the need for keeping the lines as the military lines and the front lines that the government wants to see. So I think the decision was forced from different sides by the fact that they couldn't really hold on to the situation, to the positions that they were in.
A lot of contractors left after 6 months, especially in the beginning of February, beginning of September, I think, and it's obviously coinciding with the Israel debacle. And a lot of these contractors, so we've made up money, we've made 3 or 4 or 5 times, the average wage salary a month. I don't really continue.
There are stories about Wagner contractees just not leaving the battlefield and not coming back. So there is some, there are stories about some people who are contracted to fight part of the Wagner group, and some of them have left and not continued on. With respect to conscription, usually it's in the spring where new conscriptees, if that's a word, where new recruits are drafted into the system, and so the older generation of people fighting for Russia, as they would for any state, go back after. I think it's a 2-year requirement they have to fulfill to serve. So there's always this danger that when you have new draftees come and the senior class leave, you have less expertise on the battlefield. And some may argue that occurred after the spring.
Postpone the conscription somewhat for this. So it's pretty big. Postponed it about a month, probably more so. Because of the black flag. But the new law basically says that contractors can't quit now. So
Exactly.
so the guys that left in September and August,
They got out when they could.
They got out and they got their money. The new guys, they just go on rolling until this war ends. So.
All right. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much for your attention. Great to have you here.